This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, welcome to the third part of the Academic Development Seminar on Research Methods. Oops. So just a reminder of what we discussed in the second video, planning your draft, engaging your sources creatively, avoiding plagiarism, quoting, summarizing, paraphrasing, and strategies for working through writer's blocks. And this is what we're going to discuss in this last part. So how to use quotes and punctuating quotes, writing introductions and conclusions, revising your work, and doing a work in progress presentation. I'll just remind you again of the common referencing styles. You can explore those websites for yourself to see how, in fact, the three styles work. And I'll mention again that Queen's favors the Chicago style because that is the style that is most suitable for the humanities. But you are welcome to use the other two styles. It's just that the Chicago style just seems to be the best adapted for papers in something like religion or theology or Bible studies. Okay, when you're using quotations, generally you can embed your quotes directly into your paragraphs if they're 4 lines or less. But if they go beyond 4 lines, then you should use indented block quotes. So let's look at each one of these kinds of use of quotes. So first of all, embedded quotes, and then how you punctuate them. So here's a quote. Imagine the provost is talking about this. The study of theology, especially the teachings of the early councils, is very important for those who wish to be ordained. So you want to quote that in your sentence, in your paragraph. So you could do something like this. The provost of Queen's College said, colon, and then the quote after that using a capital, okay? And then you see at the end of the sentence, you put close quotes, and then the footnote there. And so then the footnote will appear at the bottom of the page, and you could put the reference, the full bibliographic reference, or if it was a conversation or a talk or something. Anyway, you could put the full reference in the footnote at the bottom of the page. Or you could do it something like this. The provost of Queen's College said, with a comma instead of a colon. Now, it's flexible on this. Usually if you use the colon and you quote from the very beginning of the sentence, you would use the capital T there. If you put a comma, it's kind of open for debate as to whether or not it's suitable to use the capital T at the beginning of the study there. You generally see that in print, so I would say it is acceptable. But if you don't want to use the capital T like that in the middle of the sentence, and if you want to somehow incorporate the quote a little bit more completely into the sentence such that it sounds like a part of speech, then you would do it this way. The provost of Queen's College said that the study of theology. And then in that case, you don't have to put a colon or a comma. The that takes the place of the punctuation. And then you would not put the capital. You would actually put the small t in the square brackets. The square brackets means that you, as the writer, have changed the quote in some way. If you wanted to put the small brackets with the T in the second example as well, you could do that. But in the first example, if you use the colon, then always use the capital for that one, okay? So it's up to you. There are various, styles. And if you, like, some people just find that the third example, the provost of Queen's College said that, the study of theology, it just flows better if you have the extra beat there with the word that. But it's really up to you. Okay, you could also do it this way. The provost of Queen's College said that, again, the study of theology, especially the teachings of the early councils, is very important, close quote, for would-be priests. So instead of saying for those who wish to be ordained, you could put for would-be priests, or for that matter, for deacons too, for would-be clergy, maybe you could say. But so in that case, you put the close quote not at the end of the sentence, but at the end of the quote, and you put the footnote immediately after the close quote. Okay, now if you also wanted to add something more to the footnote, you might put the footnote right at the end of the sentence, but generally speaking, you would put it right at the end of the quote. And then same kind of thing here. The provost of Queen's College said that now maybe you didn't want to add that part, especially the teaching of the early councils. You wanted to leave that out, so you would put an ellipsis there. So the provost of Queen's College said that the study of theology, and then you've cut out that clause. So ellipsis shows that you've cut something out of the sentence. Is very important, close quote, for would-be priests. Just make sure that whatever you have used, which is direct words, all of that is within the quotation marks. Or you could break it up. You could actually break the quote up. So this would be an example of that. The provost of Queen's College believes that it is very important for those who wish to be ordained. So that's part of the actual quote. To study theology, especially the teachings of the early council. So basically what you've done there is you've taken the original quote, broken it into two pieces, and rearranged it within your sentence, mixed in with your own words. And you see how both parts of the quote are within their own quotation marks there. But you don't have the footnote at the end of each one. You have the footnote only at the end of the sentence as a whole, right? Only at the end of the second quote. Now, if you do it that way, you have to be a little bit careful, because as soon as you start taking bits of a quote and putting it into a sentence of your own structure, there is the danger that you might slightly change the meaning of what's being said. So just make sure that you have not in any way changed the meaning of what's being said. In this quote, the meaning has not been changed at all. But if you take bits and put it in another sentence, it may in fact change the meaning just a little bit. Okay, now here is something that drives me crazy, quite frankly, a question of punctuation. It is traditional in the Chicago style to finish a quote like this. So the provost of Queen's College believes that it is very important for those who wish to be ordained to study theology, especially the teachings of the early councils. And you see the quotation marks is right there at the end of the sentence. That also happens to be the end of the second part of the quote. So it goes period, quotation marks, and then footnote. Okay, so now technically speaking, the original quote, okay, let's go back to the original quote that you've taken that from, up at the top there, the study of theology, especially the teachings of the early councils, comma, is very important for those who wish to be ordained. So in the original quote, the word councils is not at the end of the sentence. Okay, so you've basically rearranged in this sentence the quotes, you've rearranged the pieces of the quote so that councils is at the end of the sentence. But here it is standard practice in the Chicago style to nevertheless put the punctuation inside the quotation marks, even though technically speaking, I mean, it seems like a small point, but it's actually going to become very insignificant in a minute, and you'll see why. The period, which is after councils, is not actually part of the quote, because councils is not at the end of the sentence in the original sentence, in the original quote, okay? But it is standard practice in the Chicago style to put the punctuation and then to put the quotation marks. So it would be rather like the difference between the first example and the second example there. The first example, so the example that's actually in the quote, so right here, is proper style within the Chicago style. It would be a little bit more accurate to do it this way: quotation marks first, close quote marks first, then the punctuation, because that period, remember, is not really part of the original quote, and then to put the footnote, or closed quotation, footnote immediately after the quote, and then the period. Okay, so either one of these two examples, and especially this one here, is actually more precise, more accurate, you might say, than this example, but this is nevertheless standard practice. Why? Because it looks better. Just typographically, this looks better than these two, even though these two are more precise. Okay. Now, that it doesn't really seem to be a big deal. You might say, well, who cares? Well, it is important, because if ever you're writing for a journal, for example, an article, you want to publish an article for a journal and they follow the Chicago style, they'll make you do the punctuation this way. And usually it's not a big deal if the punctuation is a period. But if the punctuation is a question or an exclamation mark, then it actually changes the meaning of the sentence. So, for example, problem in change in meaning and emphasis. Look at these two sentences. The provost of Queen's College said that the study of theology is not particularly important for those who wish to be ordained. And in that case, you use the exclamation mark is the punctuation which is inside the quotation marks. This would be standard Chicago practice, standard Chicago style. Okay. But the problem with that is it makes it look as if the quotation mark is actually part of the original quote. And that would suggest that it's the provost of Queen's College who is emphasizing the fact that the study of theology is not particularly important for those who wish to be ordained, and that he's putting that he's making that emphasis. On the other hand, if you are less stylistically proper, but more accurate in terms of meaning, you would do the second example. The provost of Queen's College said that study of theology is not particularly important for those who wish to be ordained. The close quote, then the footnote, then the exclamation mark. And what that suggests is that you, as the author of this, are the one who is putting the emphasis. In other words, you're saying, oh my goodness, did you hear that the provost of Queen's College said that the study of theology is not important for those who wish to be ordained? For goodness sakes, I can't believe he said that, right? So if the exclamation mark is on the outside, then the suggestion is you're saying it and saying, you can't believe he actually said that. But if it's on the inside, then it's the provost himself who is putting emphasis on, you don't have to study theology. So you can see that if it's an exclamation mark, and the same thing happens as if it's a question, right? A change of meaning will actually take place. Not so really if it's just a period. And so when you're writing, and if you're using the Chicago style, and you want to really be proper, really following the punctuation style, I personally I don't like I mean, I'm in this case I would much prefer, not just in terms of meaning, but I always want to be really really accurate, so I always prefer to do it this way, because that is the more accurate. But if I were going to publish something, then if the journal uses the proper punctuation for the Chicago style, they would make me do it this way. And so basically what you have to do then is you really just have to restructure your sentence to make it so that that change in meaning just doesn't occur. You just have to write the sentence in a different way. So really, really watch that. I mean, you may not think it's a big deal, but if you start publishing, it is a big deal. It becomes a big deal really, really quickly. So just be very, very aware that you're not putting an emphasis where it really doesn't belong. Like, you don't want to communicate um, that the provost of Queen's College is, well, you don't want to say that anyway. That's just an example in the sentence, right? Okay, so just beware of that. Okay, now let's look at indented block quotes. So for more than 4 lines, okay, provost of Queen's College said. So that sentence there would be part of your main paragraph. Okay, so let's say it's either the beginning of a paragraph or perhaps it's at the end of a paragraph, and then indented like this, a block quote. It is very important for those who wish to be ordained to study theology, especially the teachings of the early councils. They must know how the doctrine of the early church developed and how it can still have relevance for us today in a totally different context. If you use a block quote, you do not need to use quotation marks. It's assumed that it's a quotation just because it's a block quote. And also usually indented block quotes like this will be single spaced. So if the rest of your paragraphs are double spaced or even space and a half, the block quotes will be single spaced, okay, and indented on, they really should be indented on both sides. Some people will indent it only on the left, but it really should be indented on both sides. And then you put the footnote at the end. So you don't put quotation marks on an indented block quote. Now, if you want to continue in that same paragraph, you just write it like this, okay? So in other words, the in there is going to be flush with the provost up above, okay? So in other words, he believes that a good theological education in the foundational doctrines of the church and how they might apply today can really help ministers to serve their parishes. So what you do is you're quoting, and that's a good use of quotes. I had said before that, I think it was in the second video, I said that part of, I mean, technically speaking, if you write a paper which is nothing but a string of quotes all strung together, you know, technically that's not plagiarism as long as you've referenced everything perfectly, but it's not a good paper either, right? Don't overuse quotes. Don't allow the quotes to make your points for you. So even if you do just start off with a quote like this, then reword it in your own words, right? Engage it. So in other words, he believes, right? So engage it in that sense. Don't just sort of make the quote and then go on, right? Now, what if you said something like this? The provost of Queen's College said that. Now, just like in the embedded quotes, you can either put the colon here and then the block quote, or you could put the that, and then you can put an ellipsis if you want. You technically don't need it because the idea is that it would go directly into the next sentence. Some people do just because spatially it looks fine, but you don't need it, right? So it could just be said that and then nothing, and then just like in the just like so here, because you use the colon, you would use the capital, right? But if you put the that, then you have to make this small case, all right? So you put the square brackets around the I, okay? And then if you wanted to start a new paragraph after that immediately, you would indent the next sentence. So now let us take a look at the kinds of courses a student of theology at Queen's College would be expected to take in their degree program. So basically you want to indent the block quote the same amount as if you were indenting the beginning of a sentence, okay? And you see on the right-hand side, it's indented on the right as well, okay? Now, how about something like this? The provost of Queen's College believes that a good theological education in the foundational doctrines of the church and how they might apply today can really help ministers to serve their parishes. So this is you. These are your words. It's not a quote. You're basically saying in your own words what the provost of Queen's College believes. For example, he said in his interview that, and then you put the quote, okay, and same kind of idea, using that, and then you make the I there a small case in square brackets. So this is another good way of doing it. You, instead of, in this example, you make the quote, in this example, you make the quote first, and then you reword it in your own words. In this example, you say it in your own words first, and then you illustrate that or you back that up with a quote, right? So the idea is you don't just want to sort of have the quote there, you want to somehow engage it, okay, or explain it in your own words. Okay, so that's enough examples, just a few. The thing that, you know, as I said, the thing that you really want to watch for is this. Really make sure that you're not changing the meaning of the sentence. If it's a question mark or an exclamation mark, if you want to use the proper Chicago style punctuation, okay? Okay. So that's enough for just punctuation and the use of quotes. But how about putting the finishing touches on your writing now? So you've been writing, you planned your draft, you organized it, you figured out how to creatively agree and disagree with your sources to really engage them. You work through writer's block, you're still writing, writing, writing. Now you're getting to the end, you want to put on the finishing touches. Yay, you're almost done. Okay, so first of all, write your introduction and conclusion last. All right, we'll talk more about that in a minute. And then what to look for when revising. Okay, so writing your introduction last. Well, it would make sense that you write your conclusion last, but why would you write your introduction last? Especially since you've got, the whole outline that you've made, right? With all the sections and the subsections and figuring out which sources you're going to use where. If you've already made a very explicit outline to begin with, why would you bother writing your introduction last? It would make sense that you would write your introduction first so that you know where you're going. Well, you never really know completely where you're going, even when you have a very good outline. Why? Because you have to allow for and I did mention this in the previous video, but I'll say it again. It's really worth saying again. You have to allow for maybe not huge major alterations, but certain alterations in your outline, because the writing process itself, first of all, it helps one to remember things, right? But it also helps one to think, to understand, and make previously unnoticed connections. And these are ideas that perhaps would not have come to you at the outline stage, at the draft, when you're just writing your original sort of draft outline. And you might not have thought of that. You have these connections in your head at that point, but the writing process itself brings out nuances in your ideas, and then suddenly you're getting all these new connections that you wouldn't have thought of just in the outline form, and maybe some of them take you in a slightly different direction. Okay, so you have to allow for alterations in your outline. That's why you want to write your introduction last, because your introduction should point your reader through. Your introduction is basically saying, okay, it's like a roadmap showing you where you're going to go through the thesis or through the paper. But if you change the direction in the middle of the paper, then you're going to have to go back to the introduction and rewrite it. So you may as well just, save it to last anyway, right? It also helps you to become more objective in the evaluation of your own thoughts. You might think you have a fantastic idea, which is really justified, but as you're writing and you're engaging the authors, your sources, you might find that, wow, maybe your idea was not as sound as you thought, or maybe your argument against a particular source was not as strong of an argument as you thought. So you might have to change that too, right? It also helps you to develop new frameworks, new conceptual lenses, new ways of thinking. So the writing process itself, and this is why some people have fear of the writing process. Fear of the writing process itself can be one of the biggest, blockages that you might encounter, because if you know that this is going to happen, maybe you feel paralyzed and you don't know how to begin. Well, that's why I talked about all those other possible little exercises that you could do to help work through that block. Okay. Let me put it this way. Don't leave, don't like really, really good, successful researchers, people who publish a lot. They don't leave things till the last minute. They start early. They write all the time. They write a little bit every single day, right? Because they know that the writing process will, like, oftentimes lead you in a different direction, right? They know that, and so they leave themselves the space and the time to allow for that kind of change in direction, right? So always make sure that, and then they're not afraid of the writing process, right? Okay, so now it's you finished the paper or the thesis, and now you're about to write the introduction. So you look for the three structural elements of an introduction. The first thing is you want to provide a contextualizing background. This is going to be especially important for a thesis, but also for, a good research paper as well. You want to provide a contextualizing background. So you establish unproblematic common ground or shared knowledge. So it is the case that such and such, something that kind of, pretty much everybody knows, but just sort of as an introduction into it. So, what's the context that you're going to be writing about? So just, discuss that first. Now, the extent of the contextualizing background should really be determined by who you envision your audience to be. If you put absolutely everything you know into it, and you're writing for a very advanced audience, you're going to look like you're an amateur. If you if you are writing as if you yourself already know a lot, and you're writing for an audience who already knows a lot, then you can leave a lot out. But if someone who doesn't know a lot already is reading it, like if you're, I don't know, if you're like this would be an extreme example, but let's say you're writing for um, an audience of advanced scientists, and you begin by talking about the mathematics times tables. I mean, that would be definitely too amateurish looking. Like that's assumed knowledge. You don't have to say everything. So the extent of how much background knowledge you put in is going to depend on who you think your audience is. If you put in too much for an advanced audience, you appear amateurish. If you don't put in enough for a less advanced audience, then maybe you're going to write above their head, sort of thing. So this is where you really have to be sensitive to your audience, right? And also, you might include a reference to a main source or two here. And we had talked before, back in the first video, when you're categorizing your notes, there's going to be some sources that are going to be very useful for just providing this contextualizing background. So this is where you're going to use some of those sources. Okay, then you want to disrupt that common ground, and this is going to give your introduction a little bit of drama. I mean, the idea is that you want to keep your reader engaged. You want to keep them interested. Otherwise, they're going to stop reading, right? They're going to read that introduction and going to say, well, that sounds boring. I'm not going to read any further. So you want to somehow catch their interest. So you provide the contextualizing background, then you say, but here's a problem. This is something that has previously gone unnoticed, or there's a complication in this, or maybe we shouldn't think of it this way anymore, something like that, right? So state a problem which disrupts that common ground. And then state the consequences of not solving that problem. So in other words, that gives your reader an incentive to continue reading your paper with the idea that, well, you're going to solve that problem, right? And this then brings you back to the researcher role and the audience roles, right? So you might say, okay, here's some, interesting information, and we all know how this fits into the common background, but there's an important question that, is coming up here, and I can help you to understand something better. Or think of this, there's a kind of a problem that's raising its head here, and I found a solution to that problem. So you want to somehow, in your disruption of the common ground, you want to somehow grip, use a little hook to grip your audience in so that you can keep them interested. And then the next step is to give your response to the problem. So if you think, for example, of an introduction, like often we think of an introduction as like one paragraph, then you get into the body of the paper. Actually, an introduction could be something like 3 paragraphs, or obviously much more, but at least 3. First paragraph, providing a contextualizing background, like it could be a section unto itself, right? Providing a contextualizing background, then disrupting the common ground, then you give your response to the problem. Now, there's kind of 2 ways that you could go here. You could simply promise an answer to the problem. You could say, okay, well, I'm going to solve that problem for you, or I've got an answer for that problem, but you don't say exactly what the problem is. You just sort of use that promise as a launching point in the introduction. Or you could very, very briefly provide the answer. Now, if you just sort of promise an answer, then I mean, this it's kind of like an issue of control, right? If you just promise an answer, but you don't really give a hint of what it's going to be, then it might entice your audience, but it might sound also a bit contentious, like you're being kind of hotty-totty sort of thing, right? But if you provide the answer very, very briefly, not fully, but extremely briefly, then you in some way allow your audience into your thinking a little bit more. And then they can, otherwise you're not sort of leaving them on, like you're not baiting them along sort of thing. I mean, you do want to hook them, but you don't want to bait them, right? Because if your reader might feel manipulated otherwise. So just, try to get a feel in your own writing. Try to get a feel for how much you want to give away. Like if you give everything away at the end of the introduction, then the reader has no reason to continue reading the paper anyway. If you give a little bit away, then it's going to interest them and they're going to continue reading it. If you don't give anything away, if you just say, I've got the answer, keep reading sort of thing, then it sounds, like I say, kind of haughty, and people might be put off by that, because they feel manipulated. So I mean, it's a very subtle thing, but there can be those kinds of, feelings that the reader might experience depending on how much information you give them from the start. So just kind of, develop a sensitivity for something like that, right? And make sure you're not being off-putting in any way. Okay, now structural elements of a conclusion. Summarize your main point again. If you have already stated it in your introduction, this is where you're going to state it more fully, because they've seen, like you stated, you might have stated it just very briefly in your introduction, and then the body of the paper is you unfolding that line of thinking, engaging your sources, et cetera, so they see how your thinking is taking place. So state it more fully, incorporating the ideas that you've unfolded in the body of the paper. So don't just repeat it word for word, but make it more full. Okay. And then add a new significance. The conclusion should sort of point beyond the paper itself, right? So new significance should emerge from the argument as it unfolds. And this provides yet another answer to the so what question, right? So somebody asks you, what are you writing about? Well, I'm writing about, such and such a problem. Well, so what? Why is that important, right? There has to be some kind of significance that emerges from this argument. And that significance should be made explicit. You should point to it explicitly in the conclusion. And then point beyond itself further, indicate areas for further research. So articulate questions that are raised by your conclusion. And you don't have to answer those questions in the conclusion. The idea is that a paper answers certain questions already, and then the idea is that it should then raise further questions for a further paper or for further research, right? So articulate the questions that can then be followed up at a later point, either by you or by someone else. And by doing that, it actually puts you into a research community, right? If people feel as though you've answered an important question and then raised further questions, which then gives them an opportunity to explore those questions, they feel engaged by you, right? They feel called by you to enter into the community as well. So always try to feel yourself engaging in this kind of research community by doing this. So treat these questions not just as questions for you, but for members of your audience as well, who might themselves follow up on these new areas of research. Okay. And then you've got your introduction, you've gotten your conclusion done now, you've got the body of the paper done now. Now you want to go back and read the whole thing over again from the start and look for these elements in the revising process. So is it clear which sentence in the introduction states your main point? Is it clear where your introduction ends? Now, it's a little bit easier if you use headings and subheadings, because then, it sort of signals to your reader, yeah, this is the end of the introduction. If you don't use subheadings and headings, then it's going to be a little bit more ambiguous. There's nothing wrong with using headings and subheadings. In fact, I encourage it. Now, if you're writing a thesis, then it's gonna be broken up into chapters, but even within chapters, you can have headings and subheadings. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I, wrote my own dissertation that way. Um, it helps your reader actually, and it can also help you as well. Um, keep on track, right? In this subsection, you're only going to talk about that. In another subsection, you're only going to talk about that. It keeps you organized, right? And the same thing there. Is the beginning of each section and subsection clearly identifiable? If you use headings, then it will be easier to make it clearly identifiable. Is it clear how each subsection or section follows from the previous? So there should be, use signaling phrases such as now, this brings us to this point, or following from the last point, like that, right? So the idea is that it should flow naturally from one section to the other using connecting phrases like that. And those phrases will also help your reader see. If you don't use headings, those kinds of phrases will help your reader see where the end of one section is and the beginning of the other is. Is it clear what role each section plays in light of the whole? You don't really want extraneous paragraphs that aren't part of the main argument. And this is where the footnote style is really helpful, because if there's something that you really, really want to say, but it's not it's like a really interesting tidbit, let's say, but it's not really part of the main argument, put it in a footnote. There's nothing wrong with putting in nice, fat, juicy footnotes. The people, if the reader wants to read them, they can. If they don't want to read them, fine. But don't, try to make sure that each section in the actual body of the paper plays some significant role in light of the whole. Anything that doesn't, stick in a footnote, all right, or leave it out. But if you really want it in, stick it in a footnote. Is it clear what sentence in each subsection or section expresses the main point of that section or subsection? So it's not just that you have a thesis of the paper as a whole, you have a main point even for each section, right? So make it very, very clear what that sentence is. Do your key terms, and I had mentioned this before, do your key terms run through all section of the report or all sections of the paper? As you read through, so when you're revising, as you read through your paper, circle the key terms to ensure that they do, and make sure that they're used continuously, that you use terms, especially if they're technical terms that have a significant meaning, make sure that you're always using the same terms in the same way. All right, and that you use those terms throughout the entire paper so that there's some continuity. Also, make sure of your spelling. And if you use certain words, like the word church, for example, students will often flip back and forth between using small c and large c. I mean, that makes sense if you're, for example, talking about the church, the Anglican Church, for example. Well, then you're going to want to use a large C there. But if you're going to say the church down the road, just the building, then you're going to use a small c there. So that makes sense, using a big C in one case, in one instance, and a small c in the other instance, because there's a different meaning. But if you're throughout the paper referring to, for example, the Anglican Church, then if you want to use a large C, use a large C throughout the whole paper. Or if you just don't feel like using a large C, if you feel like using a small c, fine. But do it throughout the whole paper. Don't flip back and forth use in your use of capitals, okay? Just be consistent. So once when you look for that kind of consistency right from the very beginning, you might, like when you have, like at the beginning, when you've determined what your key terms are going to be, even before you start writing, when you've determined what your key terms are going to be, you should decide right then and there whether you're going to capitalize them, all right? And do so throughout the entire paper, because it's quite frustrating for your reader to see this kind of flip-flop back and forth in your use of capitals. Is it clear where your conclusion begins? Is it clear which sentences in the conclusion restates your main point, states it more fully, and raises questions for further research? So just make sure that, go through your paper when you're revising, and just make sure that you have a check mark on all of those questions, that you've gotten them all down, okay? Okay, last thing, doing a work in progress presentation. Let's say that you're writing a paper for a conference. Let's say you're working on a thesis and you're not quite finished it yet, but you're going to present your work in progress at a conference. How do you do that? Well, something like this. You present your story, right? You can talk about how your thesis has evolved in terms of your topic, focus, question, hypothesis, right? So, how the writing process itself has led you to raise new questions, how what you thought was going to be your thesis has, altered a little bit, and now you're asking a slightly different kind of, question, right? You could also talk about your understanding of the literature and where your own research will fit in. And this is also very important um, if you're doing a thesis as opposed to just a paper. After your introduction, you're going to also want to do a review of the field, a review of the literature in the field. So, what have other people said about this topic? And where is your own research going to fit in? So, how are you going to engage those sources? Are you going to disagree? How are you going to disagree? Are you going to answer something that's like, is there a gap in the literature that you want to fill? Do you think that the field has somehow misunderstood something and you want to correct that misunderstanding, right? And so again, all of this is going to relate to your researcher roles, right? So where are you going to place yourself in the context of the field, right? Um, and then how far have you gotten in the research, the extent to which you feel that you have begun to achieve your project's goals, all right? So it's perfectly fine to do that kind of work in progress presentation. Okay, just once again, I'll remind you of the marking system at Queen's. We talked about that very explicitly in the first video. You can also find it described in the same kind of detail on the Queen's College website there. You go to current students and then academic and related policies. There's the mark breakdown, and then you can see the more explicit description that I read in the first video on the website there. So, as you're going through writing your papers and thinking about these ideas, keep that marking system in mind as well. And hopefully now you can be a very good researcher. And see, the halo means that you're an angelic researcher. You're very good in two ways. You're very good in terms of your competence, but you're also good in terms of your morals. You're not plagiarizing. Okay, I hope that's helpful. And that is the end of the academic seminar on research methods.